We all have our own sacred stories. Let me show you one of mine. This was taken at my daughter's home in Vermont. We were celebrating Tricia and my golden wedding anniversary. The kids all gathered around the campfire, and each child, son-in-law, grandchild took turns saying what we meant to them. You see why it's sacred to us. We all have them from all kinds of families. I know that I am blessed to have been in a family that is filled with love and to be surrounded in the present with a family filled with love. Not everyone has that blessing. The family I grew up in was in northeastern Pennsylvania. It was huge. You see, I was one of 9. There were 3 girls first, then 6 boys. Even though you could on occasion get lost in the crowd, I was always loved by both of my parents. There was never any doubt about that. But it should be said that my mother was a saint. My childhood memories of her come from the late 1940s and early 1950s, that time when all those TV programs that had the nostalgic image of a family together were on the air. As I look back on my childhood years, I'm filled with wonderful memories of family life, especially around a large table or around the piano. And I confess to you that among those memories, there are some of guilt. My mother's memories, my memories of my mother, evoke in me a sense of guilt because it was a different age. Mom never questioned that once the girls were gone, she would do the laundry, she would bake the bread, she would do the ironing, she would make the meals. As we boys got older, we did inherit some chores. About 5 or 6, I learned how to do the dishes, and I actually learned how to do ironing. And then later, when I was about 7 or 8, my job, it fell to me, where others had it before me, to go get the cows. Now, what did that mean? We had a cow, had a large family, and in the summertime, we pastured her with a neighbor who had a barn several blocks from our house in a pasture. And every day at 4 o'clock in the summer, I would have to go get the cows. After a while, when I got older, I had to help with the haying as well. That was not so easy. My father worked hard all day, and he helped around the house a little bit. But Mom was clearly the workhorse. Think about it. Imagine raising 6 boys, some of them troublemakers, with those large appetites. And when I was in high school, she worked all day in a factory to boot. I cringe to this day about how unfair we were to her. She was not a complainer, however. In spite of all she did for us kids, she did take time for each one of us as well. I remember my favorite time was when I would go to bed at bedtime and I would ask Mom to tell me a story. And she would haul out the big old book of Bible stories. And my favorite by far was Samson and Delilah. That was filled with everything you could possibly want. A hero fighting the Philistines, wrestling with wild animals, being betrayed by a scheming and beautiful woman, but ultimately getting revenge by having the building around the Philistines, the enemy, crash down and kill them all. I suspect many of you have memories of storytelling from the early years of your own lives. So what is it about stories? Go back in time as far as you want, and there will be stories, as long as there are human records, and even some of them are not written. They are painted on cave walls. They're stories that tell of danger, of pleasure, of fear and joy. If it's a human trait, it gets depicted, and they cut across time, geography, and culture. Stories were, and still are, a big part of my own family. When there were just 4 of us, Tricia and I have 2 daughters, stories were a bedtime routine. When the kids were really young, I would tell them stories. As they got a little bit older, I'd read to them. And then as they got older still, we'd read to each other. One time, I remember after my older daughter was gone from the house and in college, graduate school actually, And before she was married, Tricia and I went to California, and we went with them to the West Coast from where they lived in Mountain View. And we spent a night together in the Pigeon Point Lighthouse Hostel, which is near Half Moon Bay. And we found a common area where we could read. And so we had started reading when all of a sudden, a strange woman walked through the room, looked at us, walked over to the couch, laid down, and then asked, "Is it okay if I listen?" Stories capture our attention immediately. Someone has said that there are but 7 archetypal narratives: overcoming the monster, rags to riches, the quest, voyage and return, comedy, tragedy, and rebirth. Each of these tropes has its own appeal, of course. Each grabs our attention and holds it until we find out what happened. Each tells us something about the meaning of our lives. Stories often have a point, a lesson, that they help us learn or realize. Usually it's something that we already know, but stories remind us and force us to say, yeah, that's right. But I also want to focus on stories that tell us about the time of our lives. Some stories are just about people living their lives. No great drama, but celebrating the ordinariness of our daily routines. A story that celebrates how we live our lives, one that makes us stop and appreciate this wonderful gift that we've been given of life. Sometimes that's all we really need. When we tell our children stories about when we were kids, many times they don't have a lesson, but children love them just the same. I remember my Aunt Vera telling us kids about when she was little. And she would tell us about hitching the horse up to the sleigh, and about the snow and the quiet and the jingling of the bells as they rode from one place to another. And I thought to myself, oh, I would love to have lived in those times. As I think back on it, what I really loved was spending the time together. That's another thing stories do. They bring us together with others in the here and now. We say to each other, I want to be here with you, to spend time with you, to bracket off time in which we can just imagine together. They focus on the time of our lives. They awaken our awareness of the here and now. That's why we have a part of our worship service that's called Time with Children. Children have a way of demanding our attention and not letting go. When we recall stories from our youth and recount them to our children, they also mark off our identities. They say, this is who I am. I'm the kid that grew up in a farm. I'm the kid that lived in a big city. I'm the one who loved baseball games. I'm the one who enjoyed baking with my mother, who learned elocution when I was a little girl, who hated doing the dishes, who couldn't get enough of roller coasters, who loved science, and on go the variations. No wonder we love telling them. No wonder we love hearing them. When kids want to know stories from when we were young, they're also asking us, who are you? They invite us to tell them our story. What's intriguing is often which stories we choose to tell and which we do not. Sharing a story that reveals our vulnerable side is often the one that brings us closest to another. They see that you're trusting them with who you are. Of course, these are the hardest ones to tell because we have to take a risk. Cultures with strong oral history traditions, which are often revisited ritually, use stories to preserve identities. These are also surely sacred stories because they capture the collective beliefs and values that bind people together. Jesus used stories, parables, to reinforce the values he taught. When he reminded his listeners of the Golden Rule in the book of Matthew and Luke. I say reminded because he was drawing on the reference to love your neighbor as yourself in Leviticus from their common Jewish tradition. Talia has beautifully taught us in her sermons that the Golden Rule is found in many, many religious traditions. So when he reminded them of the Golden Rule, there was no mistaking what he meant. In Luke, to bring the message home, he tells them a story. Here he says is what it means to love your neighbor as yourself. There was a Samaritan, and we know the story. The Jews and the Samaritans did not get along. They basically hated each other. But Jesus chose the Samaritan to be the one who loved his enemy by helping the waylaid traveler lying alongside the road. By telling the story, Jesus made it real in a way that simply saying, love your neighbor as yourself, could not. The Jews were forced to confront the depth of what loving your neighbor means. The thing about many of Jesus' parables was that he used them to force his listeners to confront hypocrisy. It wouldn't do simply to embrace the platitude. The story takes things to a different level. When a story makes you finally realize and understand the depth of the Samaritan's love, when you didn't see it before, you can't brush it off as just an exception. One man rising above the normal ugly Samaritan status he had. You can't bracket off this love and say, that doesn't apply to me. You're called to embrace it. Love is the greatest commandment if you call yourself a follower of Jesus. On it, Jesus says, hang all the law and the prophets. When the Pharisees walked past the man beside the road, it was because he was less than they. They demeaned him. We're struggling these days to know how to balance the retention of certain cultural symbols of our own American past. Times filled with fond memories for some, but for others not. For others who were demeaned or are demeaned by them. Admittedly, some of these decisions about how to balance our past with the present are hard. It may help in deciding where you stand to ask yourself, why do we find no monuments in Germany to Heinrich Himmler or Adolf Hitler? That's not because the Germans want to forget about their past. They don't want to pretend it didn't happen. They revisit the memories today by publicly exhibiting them in the concentration camps that they've preserved for that purpose. Oh, you say, well, that's totally different. Is it? It's an extreme case, admittedly, but let's ask ourselves to be clear on how exactly it's different. I don't deny that some of our dilemmas may be different, but asking how may give us insight when we're trying to decide which symbols we need to take down and how we want to exhibit times of our lives of which we are not proud. So we can't appeal to tradition or culture or even the letter of some religious law to avoid what the story of the Good Samaritan has to teach us. Love triumphs everything else. Jesus says, I have given you a new law, that you love one another. When you see, for example, a beautiful love clearly exhibited in couples, whether they are gay, lesbian, bi, or straight, you have no choice but to honor it and celebrate it. I call myself a Christian, and I do so for a very specific reason. Jesus boiled everything down to one commandment. Everything is based on it. We have to love. The most sacred stories we can tell often illustrate how we love one another. We do have a song that we sing here. They'll know we're God's children by our love, by our love. I firmly believe that the only hope for the human race is that we all learn how to love one another. If we do not, I do not see any salvation in our future. Well, I can hear the responses already. Is he kidding? Do you have any idea how naive this is? Wake up, look around you. Don't assume people are good. They'll walk all over you. And yet he told us to love. But there are folks today who want to call themselves Christians who are more concerned about the letter of the law than they are about what Jesus told them to do. In my view, some of these folks would have you believe that they're the real Christians. But I see them as the Pharisees of our day. In his time, Jesus called the Pharisees hypocrites. I do not understand how anyone today can call him or herself Christian and yet forbid love for cases they don't like. Must not a follower of Jesus celebrate love between two people, whoever they are? There's a final way in which stories make us focus on the time of our lives. They bring us into the present moment, the time in our lives, right now. This is what I cherish in a good poem. In its own way, a good poem is a sacred story. For me, the best poems lift us out of the flowing current of our lives and force us to stop, to take stock of this gift of existence we've been given. Someone has summarized in 3 phrases what we all respond to in poems by Mary Oliver and others. Pay attention, be amazed, talk about it. One of my favorite poems is Wendell Berry's The Peace of Wild Things. It helps me appreciate the value of the time of my life by reminding me to pay attention to the present moment. It is for me truly a sacred story. Listen as Berry writes, "When despair for the world grows in me, and I wake in the night at the least sound in fear of what my life and my children's lives may be, I go and lie down where the wood drake rests in his beauty on the water and the great heron feeds. I come into the peace of wild things who do not tax their lives with forethought of grief. I come into the presence of still water, and I feel above me the day-blind stars waiting with their light. For a time, I rest in the grace of the world and am free." May we all pay attention, be amazed, and talk about the times of our lives. Amen.
Joining us at the United Church of Gainesville today to learn more about who we are and what we believe and to support our ministry, please visit ucgainesville.org.
Remember to join us each Sunday at 11:15 a.m. for Sunday seminars on Zoom. The link can be found in your email bulletin.